Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to explain to you why you should not be taken in by pseudo-scholarly or even real scholarly claims of authority behind the musical edition that is used for the performance in question. Now, I did a video a long time ago, about 3 years ago, about critical editions. And why some of them are better than others. And I do suggest that you go have a look at that. If you're curious, you can find it very, very easily by just entering in the little search box on my channel homepage, Critical Editions, and it will pop up. But beyond that, there are three kinds of things that you're going to deal with, because musical scholarship is all the rage these days. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is the sort of unholy alliance between performers and academics, in which academics put together a score of some well-known or unknown work, and they can immediately find, through their relationships with various performers, an outlet to have it played and quite often recorded. And that gives a lot of impetus to that kind of work, because it's kind of a thankless task, as often as not, unless you're actually hired by a major publisher to do the work, which sometimes happens. Sometimes. The bottom line is this. There are three types of editions, as I said, I think, or whatever, that we're going to be talking about. One is an Urtext, one is a critical edition, and the last is a practical edition, which is the one that seldom gets mentioned, but most often gets used. Let's start at the beginning with an Urtext. Urtext is German, of course, because musicology as a profession is kind of German in its origins, and Ur means original, primal original, like the fourth movement, the song in Mahler's Second Symphony, which is called Urlicht, primeval light. So a primeval text is quite simply the original, most authentic, basic, unadorned, unedited text, what the composer actually wrote. Now, you would think that's simple, but of course, in much older music, we don't have manuscript copies. We only have copies. Well, we have manuscript copies. We don't have original manuscripts. We have copies of manuscripts in other manuscripts. Or you might have only a published edition, or you might have, secondary sources. And so, in that case, technically speaking, an Urtext is impossible, because it's not an Urtext of what the composer originally wrote. It's an Urtext of what we have, representing what we think the composer originally wrote. So already you're dealing with issues of source material. But essentially what an Urtext ought to do is to take a piece of music and tell us in easy to read, because composers' manuscripts could often be a horror show or a mess, settle once and for all what the original authentic text is without doing anything else. So as often as not, Urtexts are unplayable. They're unplayable because composers are messy. Terribly messy and inconsistent. And they use lots of shorthand, a lot of shorthand notation for repetitions of things, or for, there was a convention, for example, in the Baroque and classical periods, where if you wanted to have something slurred or something played staccato, you might indicate the first couple of whatever in a passage, and because the passage was the same tune or the same phrase, you don't bother marking the rest of it. You didn't have to. People would know what to do. And an Urtext technically should leave that alone. It should show us what the composer's original notation was. There are also tons of conventions regarding dynamics and phrasing and things which need to be clarified for modern performers. And an Urtext will not do that. And so for that reason, an Urtext is useful for scholars. It's useful for learning about the compositional process that the composer employed, and also how neat and clean a composer they were. There are some composers, for example, Brahms, for whom an Urtext is well, first of all, Brahms destroyed a lot of his manuscripts, but he was a very meticulous composer. And so his published editions are going to be completely representative of what he wanted. And if you do a new edition of something which purports to be an Urtext, you're going to make very few changes. He made very few mistakes. He cleaned everything up before it saw the light of day. And so a Brahms Urtext is going to be very different from a Beethoven Urtext, which could be an unholy mess because he was scribbling and scratching out and replacing, or a Janicek Urtext, which is probably undoable, quite frankly, because his manuscripts, you have to see them to believe them. I mean, until he gave them to a copyist to clean up, they're almost illegible. So there are all kinds of issues depending on the composer with an Urtext. If somebody tells you, and here's the point, that they are making a recording based on an Urtext, it is an absolutely useless piece of information in most cases, because that Urtext will not be a performable edition of the work in question. It will be what the composer actually wrote, but not what people played. What people played is what happens when they took that manuscript and copyists wrote out individual parts or made further copies, or people did things. It depends on what it was, of course. If it's a symphony, it's a bigger, complicated process because you've got a whole orchestra to write for, you've got a big score, then you've got the individual parts that people play. If it's a piano sonata or a chamber work, it's usually less complicated, but it still can be a major project to finally arrive at a clean original text. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's written for other scholars or performers who want to study what the composer wrote as an aid to arriving at their own interpretation of how to perform the music. Because, like I said, how to perform the music is a job accomplished in what I call a practical edition. The practical edition is exactly what it says. It cleans up all of the ambiguities. And it cleans up those ambiguities through editorial intervention. Somebody goes in and says, okay, well, these few things were slurred, so all of them should be. Or he said in the first time this theme appeared that it should be played piano, and he doesn't mention it the second time because he figured we'd figure it out from the first time. So I'm going to write piano here so that people do the same thing the second time around. Those kinds of editorial interventions and many others, sometimes you have to write out whole passages, are necessary in arriving at an edition that people can actually play. So we have the Urtext, and then we have the practical edition. So once the practical edition has been taken care of, there's something in the middle. That thing in the middle between Urtext and practical is a critical edition. Now, a critical edition should take the composer's manuscript or an Urtext as its basis, or it may take the first published edition if there is no manuscript, or if that is a more authentic and reliable source. What really matters is, A, how close the source is to the composer. That is, did the composer really have a hand in producing the optimal source, for example, the published edition, or the manuscript that was used as the basis for the published edition, which in German is called the Stichvorlage, something like that, or alternately, the source that contains the most useful information about how to play the music, the most complete, the most thoroughly documented. So a critical edition has to look at all of the available sources, ideally, some do and some don't, and weigh them, weigh their importance, and decide which one is going to be the fundamental basis of the edition, which ones are going to be used to supplement that fundamental basis, often based on what ambiguities they resolve in what might be the primary source. And then all of the other sources and pieces of knowledge and information, letters and documents, whatever, having to do with the score in the widest sense. A score being not just the thing that is written, but all of the information that we know about how to play the thing that is written and what the composers and the composer's contemporaries and authorized representatives thought about the thing that is going to be played. So critical editions involve heavy, usually, unless it's Brahms, heavy editorial intervention. And that this editorial intervention may very seriously change what we usually know about the piece. But here's the other point to keep in mind. That doesn't mean that the critical edition is right and all of the others are wrong. There may be numerous contemporary sources of works. Haydn's symphonies, for example. Most manuscripts of Haydn's symphonies have vanished. We don't have them. So what we have are published sources. And there were many. Sometimes there were hand-copied manuscript sources. And on top of that, there were multiple published sources in different countries and regions. We don't always know to what extent those sources had Haydn's approval or his sanction, or if he would have cared. We have to weigh all of the evidence and see what makes the most sense. Sometimes you use chronology to see what came first, what is closest to what we think Haydn may have wrote, or what the source for this final published edition may have been, or who the editors were, and what their normal practice was, and what their reputation was for honesty and decency and rectitude in publishing accurately what they got, or whether they stole it from someone else and just changed it. There's a million factors that go into making a critical edition. And for that reason, a critical edition has no claim to any particular authenticity or authority absent a showing that a certain amount of work has gone into it, that the decisions that the editor of the critical edition makes are ones that we would agree with and that make sense. So where does this leave us? Well, critical editions tend to present choices between all of the different variants. So they have a big sort of index in the back, a Revisionsbericht, which tells us what changes the editors made and what possibilities there were, and the performers get to choose if they want. And if there are many, many possibilities, if it's really a crazy bunch of sources for a very popular work, then the critical edition will, of course, become, like the Urtext, a practical edition, where the editor recommends the version that you ought to play based on what they regard as the most authentic and sensible and realistic options. But there are always options in critical editions. And for that reason, when you finally get to the performance, and this is where you need to be kept aware of what's happening, it doesn't matter whether something's an Urtext or a critical edition, as often as not. Sometimes they are really, really important. They are, I get it. There are some works, for example, operas. When I used to talk with the great Verdi and Rossini Italian opera scholar, Philip Gossett, who was a genius at this thing and the master of putting together Urtext and critical editions of these works. And they were horrendously complicated because all that existed, if we had a composer's manuscript, was the work's performing history. And that performing history changed from performance to performance to performance, as whole arias were cut or things rewritten or entire acts substituted. In Act 3, Verdi's Don Carlo has a 5-act version and a 4-act version, and there are like 10 different endings to it, none of which clarify what really happens at the end. I mean, you can make yourself completely insane. And so when the performance history of the work is the manuscript, coming up with a critical edition becomes impossibly difficult, crazily difficult. But the project is really necessary. I mean, Philip Gossett I had a conversation once about Verdi's Un ballo in maschera. Now, as some of you may know, Un ballo in maschera has a ridiculous setting because of the censor. It's a story of the assassination of Gustav II of Sweden, and the characters are all Swedish, and it happened in Stockholm. And because the censors would not allow Verdi to perform an opera that involved the assassination of a king, of an aristocrat, he had to move the whole opera to Puritan Boston. And it happens in Boston Common, and the head is the governor of Boston. Now, it so happens, according to Philip, that the original version that Verdi wrote exists. It's recoverable. And it takes place in Stockholm and has the real names of all the characters. And putting that right, undoing the work of the censors is a justifiable thing, but it would take a tremendous amount of work. And in addition, Philip Gossett pointed out, he still has to deal with, for example, the Verdi family, the people who are sitting on manuscripts, and publishers who have published defective editions, who have an interest in not changing it and not going through the time and expense of redoing the whole thing. And we're not even getting to the musical aspect. the musical changes which have made. Verdi was, for example, fascinating in his handling of dynamics. If you look at Il Trovatore, I just found this amazing when I got the critical edition, because the aria Il Balin, which is, sung by the Conte de Luna in the third act or fourth act, is one of those acts. Anyway, the dynamic range of piano, it has like 16 P's. Pianissimo. If you look at a published score of Il Trovatore, they will just write pianissimo, because nobody knows what 16 P's is going to sound like, or expects performers to differentiate 16 pianos from 15 degrees of softness. I mean, it's unrealistic, but it tells you what Verdi was thinking. And it tells you that he expected a huge range of dynamics in his performances, a very, very helpful piece of information. And you want to know where that range applies, in what pieces or what phrases and things. So, yeah, the critical edition is really cool and really important. And it's wonderful to see in his Rossini editions, for example, with Phil Gossett, the variety of articulation, because Rossini was obsessive compulsive. He even prescribed the distance between the players and their music stands in the pit. I mean, he was really obsessive compulsive. That's why he burnt out when he was quite young and gave it up. He was having a nervous breakdown compared to the standards that prevailed at the day and what Rossini intended. And Rossini used tons of shorthand. He composed very rapidly, but with extreme precision as regards articulation. And he used mixed articulations. You might see staccato in one voice with legato in another voice. All of this was cleaned up and Baudelarized to make performance more simple as time went on. And the existing sources, published often by Ricordi or one of those publishers, are full of these kinds of editorial decisions, and no one knows who made them. So again, coming up with a critical edition that shows us what the guy really wrote, what the order of numbers is, and how they should end, and what's going to, all the revisions. I mean, it's wonderfully and fascinating, and it offers performers many, many options. But Philip knew that he had to have also a practical edition, that he had to give performers clear recommendations about what to do in real life. That's also true of pieces that are often cut, usually operas and things like that too, where you have emendations and abridgments where the original, unless you're making a recording where it doesn't matter, would just be hellaciously long. And so, they could suggest places where you could edit or chop or make things more theatrically effective. This happens in Janacek's Yennefer. There's a whole aria in Act 1 for Kostelnichka, an explanation aria, where she talks about her miserable first marriage and how her husband was an alcoholic who beat her, and that's why she's so strict and miserable and irritating. But it stops the action of Act 1 dead in its tracks. So Janacek took it out. I've seen performances of Yennefer that restore it. And it's lovely, it's wonderful music, it's only like 3 or 4 minutes long, but it does stop the action dead in its tracks, because everybody is talking about, they're all celebrating Steva's return from the army, and they want to know what's going to happen, and Yennefer's pregnant, and she's about to forbid her to get married until he can stay sober for a year, which is the thunderclap that falls, the doom that falls on the characters and motivates all of the action that happens subsequently. And Janacek wanted to get right to that. So the Kostelnichka's role is tiny, absolutely tiny. She comes in and she says, "No, you can't get married." Boom, and off she goes. Instead of singing an aria where everybody freezes like this and the spotlight focuses on her and she pours out this personal reminiscence of her own misery. No. It was a good thing to chop it out. But some people want to put it back. And then if you have a critical edition, you have it in an appendix. And the performers can do that if that's what they feel like they want to do. There are a million considerations. But my point in concluding this rather lengthy diatribe is this. When it comes to the actual performance, you have not only the layer of editorial decisions that went into creating either the critical or practical edition that the performers are actually working with, you have their decisions in performance. And those decisions in performance may or may not reflect what the critical edition is. I mean, I have heard on recordings and elsewhere many, many times, so many examples of performers. I mean, most orchestras, for example, if it's a popular work, own the music. They have a score library. They have their own versions. Those versions consist of layers and layers and layers of corrections, which the music librarian has entered at the behest of the conductor, who also owns their own version of the works. And often when a conductor flies in, he'll send the music librarian his or her marked up score and say, okay, enter all this stuff in the parts. And so you erase everything that came before and you write in all the new stuff and you do whatever the conductor said. That conductor may or may not have paid any attention to a critical edition. And if they did, if the orchestra has spent a fortune to acquire brand new clean parts and scores from the publisher who has tried to recopyright the otherwise public domain work, then you have no idea what's going to happen on the day. It may happen that the conductor decides to play one passage marked slower faster, or to play something staccato, which should be legato, or to change the balances or the instrumentation of certain passages for their own reasons. Or they've made selections from the options in the critical edition, which are not the ones recommended in the practical edition. So on top of all of that, you have the player's interpretation. It's even more personal when it comes to solo works like piano sonatas, solo things like that, violin sonatas, where the performers have the liberty to do quite a bit in bringing their own view of the piece in terms of interpretation. Nobody plays a critical edition robotically. And this was particularly driven home to me in talking about that absolutely loathsome and vile performance of Bruckner's Seventh that Simon Rattle and the London Symphony did, which allegedly is a critical edition, which sounds just like every other performance of Bruckner's Seventh in all ways that matter, except that the performance is horrible, absolutely horrible. And is it a mechanical, literal rendering of a critical edition, absolutely devoid of personality? Well, it is mechanical and absolutely devoid of personality. Is it what the critical edition says you should do? Should you suck out every bit of emotion or character or dynamic range or drama from the work in question? Of course not, because beyond all this work with the stuff that's in print, there is the piece of music, which is none of those things. It's the realization of what's on the page in real time, in sound, as the performers do their thing. And if the interpretation is a snooze fest or perverse in some way, it doesn't matter whether they're using an Urtext or a critical edition or the practical edition of any of those things. None of that matters. It's going to be horrible. And you're much better off hearing a great performance of what would be considered a corrupt edition than a totally dreary, literal, featureless performance of a critical edition that purports to be nothing else. And so many performers today want either, if they're period instrument people, the instruments to do the interpreting, to make the performance, or the edition that they're using. It's the same thing. It's the opportunity to abdicate responsibility for the musical result. Thomas Beecham famously used non-critical editions of the Haydn symphonies. So did Colin Davis in his London Symphony performances with the Concertgebouw. And the great Haydn scholar H.C. Robbins Landon was furious about that because his editions, which are critical editions, existed at the time. But the orchestra had its versions, the conductor had his version, and he was going to use what he was familiar with and what he thought he could play well. And as it turned out, Colin Davis did a beautiful set of Haydn London symphonies. He really did. But were they critical editions? Hell no. I'd still rather hear a great performance of the defective edition than an authentic performance of whatever the critical edition purports to be, that has no personality and no vitality and nothing positive. So I want you to keep those things in mind. Do not get suckered into thinking that because a recording alleges it's a new edition of something, that new edition has any particular authority or value in and of itself, absent what the performers do. The value lies in the performance, in the intelligence and the choices made by the performers, not in the scholarly backdrop to those decisions. Most of the time. I always have to qualify it because there are always exceptions in our musical life. And I don't want to denigrate the work of serious scholars who make beautiful, beautiful, new, clean, clear, intelligently thought out editions for performers to work from. It's a labor of love, and it's a marvelous thing. But the value of it, well, that varies widely. It varies widely, and in and of itself, absent the inspiration and genius of the performing forces or performers in question, it doesn't have a lot of obvious worth. And that's my take on the subject. And I hope that this has clarified some things in your minds so that when you go shopping around and you hear things and you hear the claims made for various performances, don't get suckered. Don't think that what you find boring and meretricious and completely off-putting is something you ought to be loving and you feel guilty about it because, well, it's a critical edition. It's what the composer really wanted. No composer wanted that. What a composer wanted was a great performance of the music, plain and simple. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.